Joining us now are the LA Times' Maria La Ganga, who's written a great piece about the many shades of blue in San Francisco, Hailey Branson-Potts, who wrote about Placer County, north of Sacramento. Used to drive through it on my way to Tahoe. Also, we have Sarah Parvini here, who wrote about the Iranian American community, specifically in Los Angeles. It's great to have all of you here. What did you find? I mean, you know, you watch the debates and you see things stereotyped, like, you know, wine caves and, you know, the folks in Northern California and Southern California are just. What did you find when it comes to the diversity among Democrats, you know, in Northern California, Southern California? What is driving? Are there any patterns, or is everybody kind of, you know, on their own program?
I mean, I think that what you see in, for example, in San Francisco, which is the bluest place in a very blue state, you see a lot of gradations, and you see a lot of people falling out on things like, you know, age is one big predictor. Finances are another big predictor. When you have like income inequality, which is the biggest issue in San Francisco, with housing prices through the roof and people having to commute a very long way. So those are some of the things that help decide people. But one of the other things is it's really interesting. It's a very, even though it's incredibly blue, there are lots of gradations. There are the cannabis Democrats, the Brownie Mary Democratic Club, who really care about whether a candidate is for legalization. Then you have the various LGBTQ groups. There's the Alice B. Toklas one, which is the conservatives ones, and then there's the Harvey Milk, and they're the more progressive ones. So what you saw there is a lot of emphasis on Bernie, but you also see things like Art Agnos, who's believed to be the very last really progressive mayor there. He's a Bloomberg guy. I spoke with a lovely 74-year-old transgender woman who basically volunteers for every lefty thing in the universe. But she also points out she's a devout Lutheran. She has symphony season tickets, and her portfolio is doing really well. She likes Bloomberg too.
People are complicated.
So complicated.
When you were up the road, you know, on the road to Tahoe there, that is not, that is a little red island in this very blue state. What does this primary look like there? When, you know, it's all we're hearing about nationally, it's all people are talking about in LA. It's probably not, you know, the big focus in Placer County.
Not as much there. That area looks much more like the middle of the country, like where I'm from in Oklahoma. It is reliably red. The county itself has voted for a Republican presidential candidate every election since 1980. So there, the primary was not as big of a focus. There, the Democratic Party is, it's much more, they feel like underdogs. There's a sense of desperation. There's a real desire to get young voters to come out just to build their numbers. It's a place where the Democratic vote is so small that they used to have bumper stickers that said just another Placer County Democrat. So there, it's very much an older group of people, and they're desperate for basically to revive the party there.
Some of the people in your reporting you wrote about who are more open to Democratic candidates were much younger people. They were starting environmental clubs in their schools, right. And you know, is that sort of? I mean, in terms of what the Democratic voter looks like there, I mean, are there opportunity? Are there certain issues? Is climate change an issue where those folks think like, hey, I can, you know, draw some attention to this? Because I would imagine a community like that, given your sort of social, you know, the social pressures from being in a community that's largely Republican, it may be difficult for people to stick their necks out and say, I don't agree with that. Are there issues that you found that are maybe a little easier for people to latch onto, that might be, you know, might give us an idea of what a Democratic candidate trying to appeal to those voters might want to emphasize?
Sure. Well, I mean, by all counts, the Democratic message for young people there and widely all over the country would appeal more to young people. I mean, issues like climate change, student loan debt, these kept coming up over and over again. And the young people there kept telling me they're issues voters. They're not blue no matter who, is what one of them told me. The problem in a place like that is you have brain drain. So once these students turn 18, they'll often cross the county line and they'll move away they're not voters in the county for long. So that's been part of the problem, is they have to keep recruiting young people who keep moving away. So the county itself is actually, if you look at the age breakdown, it's actually older than the rest of the state, because there aren't as many opportunities, and so the young people who do stay are desperately trying to organize themselves. They actually have tried several times to have, a Placer County young Democratic club, and as one of them told me, it flopped. So it's kind of constant churn is what they're looking at.
Sarah Parvini, when you went into the Iranian American community in Los Angeles, you found not a monolithic group, but a diverse group of people who have various reasons for supporting different candidates. They're not all with Bernie, but a lot of them seem to be.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that like any ethnic community in Los Angeles or across the country, the Iranian American electorate is not a monolith, like you said. You certainly have people who support Bernie Sanders, and I went up to Oakland and they even had a forum in Bernie Sanders' Oakland campaign office, Iranians for Bernie. And then here in Southern California, you've got people who support someone who's more like Joe Biden. You've got, of course, Bernie supporters, but you've also got sort of a conservative contingent as well who support President Trump. And so I think what you would find is that based on people's lived experiences, based on perhaps when they immigrated to the United States or whether they were born here, you'll find these different kinds of fissures to divide the community.
How does that break down? Because this is a presidency that has really engaged directly with Iran and has a very clear position on the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama and the other countries put in place in 2015. President Trump ripped that up. And it sounds like there are some Iranian Americans who are happy that he ripped it up, and there are others who are there clear lines in terms of age or perhaps affluence? Are there other what sort of did you find maybe helps separate some of these people within that community into sort of more hardline pro-Trump positions and more Bernie Sanders type positions?
So there are a lot of things. There are things like your socioeconomic status, which I think is, again, true for a lot of the country, regardless of what your ethnic background is. But, among the Iranian American community, what a lot of people were telling me is that they also see a big generational gap, where the younger people who either were born here or who came as children, so they count as, 1.5 generation, they might be leaning toward a more liberal candidate, a candidate who would be willing to have some sort of diplomacy with Iran, whether that's Obama style or, whatever a Sanders might do, But then again, if you're older, that doesn't mean that you automatically support Trump. That's certainly not true. But the more conservative people who I have met who are Iranian tend to be older.
Do you think, this question we've been talking tonight about how it looks pretty clear at this point that the Democratic nominee will be either Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. I'm going to ask you each this question, but in terms of, we'll start with the Iranian American community. I know we've said these are not monolithic groups. We don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. Do you think that one or the other has a better shot at turning out those communities, drawing support from that community? I mean, do you think Bernie Sanders is in a better position than Joe Biden to pull support from that community?
It's a good question. Certainly it seemed like, just from what I saw on the ground, among the younger Iranian American voters, there were people who were millennials or maybe even Gen X who were very energized about supporting Sanders. However, if you look back at January, it didn't get too much news, but Biden had a fundraising event at a very prominent Iranian entrepreneur's home in Orange County. And while that was not geared necessarily just toward the Iranian American community, and it had people from all over present, that leads me to believe that certainly there are more moderate Iranian Americans who would throw their weight behind Biden.
Hailey, same question. Do you think that a guy like Bernie Sanders has any prayer pulling votes? I know it's a small community. It's not going to maybe change that much in the bigger picture. But in terms of making those inroads, we saw, Pete Buttigieg and other states really try to be precise in going into places that are traditionally Republican counties and saying, I can get delegates out of these places if I talk to these people. They've never been talked to by a Democrat before. Between Biden and Bernie, I mean, do you think that Joe Biden is the one that has more of a chance to maybe get a few votes in some of those kinds of places?
Again, it's a generational divide.
Really?
There, it's very strong. The young people there were adamant that they were all big Sanders supporters. One of the young men I spoke to, he's 19, he helped found the Sierra Foothills Young Democrats Club, which stretches across 3 counties, because that's what they have to do. He said the hill I'll die on is that you don't win these areas that have been dominated by Republican candidates by being moderate. So the young people I spoke to up there, they're all going with Sanders.
Yeah.
The older folks were much more moderate. But the county party there is struggling. I mean, as Democrats are elsewhere, to kind of identify itself.
Mm-hmm. And up in Northern California, I mean, it's so different, right, from this corridor to Silicon Valley, and then to San Francisco and the East Bay and Marin County. I mean, it's so diverse. How do you see this? Ultimately, California is going to go in the blue column on election night.
No matter what
it doesn't really matter. The popular vote doesn't really matter. But in terms of who has maybe more of an emotional connection with California voters, do you see all the same Bernie voters turning out for Joe Biden, vice versa? Do you see that this choice tells us much about where California voters are now that Bernie Sanders just won the state's primary?
That's a really good question. And I mean, when you look at, for example, in Northern California, there was almost no one there working on Biden's behalf.
Right.
Bernie was completely organized. That area, San Francisco County, is the most Democratic in the entire state. It is the least Republican in the entire state, and it has the highest percentage of no party preference. Those folks there care about healthcare. It's a real big deal. Housing, a real big deal. But when you look at the folks on the ground, the Bernie ones are incredibly organized and incredibly energetic. And I went to a canvassing event, and there was one woman who was old enough that she was a red diaper baby. And then there were people who were voting for the first time. One of the things that Hailey always tells me, as we sit there and talk about this at work, is that the young people might adore Bernie Sanders, but, would you like to say it?
Young people don't vote.
Young people don't vote.
So discouraging, but also reality-based.
Consistently. I mean, based on the data we looked at, voters ages 18 to 24 consistently vote at a rate 20% lower than the rest of the population. So excitement, will that translate to votes? It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, and it's true. This is one of the things that Bernie Sanders has said. I can expand the electorate. I can excite people. You need enthusiasm. We have not seen the electorate, really expand in any of these early states.
Not at all.
Especially not the ones that he has won. And your point is really interesting about Joe Biden, the lack of organization. I mean, he's run a campaign. We all scratched our heads. We saw him basically sort of throw his hat out there, not bother with organization. He's not real good in the debates. His whole strategy was kind of like, I'm Joe Biden, you know me. And it didn't seem like it was working until it was working.
And it really worked.
Yeah.
Tonight we're seeing it's working in ways that are incredibly surprising.
This is a great discussion, and I really appreciate all of you staying up late and coming down here and chatting about your reporting, because it's great reporting. It's worth paying for if you don't already have an LA Times digital subscription. But I've enjoyed reading it. It gets me smarter, because when you're in that DC bubble and you're just Trump, Trump, Trump all the time, you can learn a few things if you read other parts of our coverage. So I thank you for your work and for staying up late with us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you all.